So now we talked a little bit about quest. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about story, and then in the end, I'm going to put this all together into one coherent supermodel thought out by me 1 week ago. Yes, a supermodel. Story. Usually, when we talk about story before the game, what we really is talking about is the main fictional frame and the starting point of the scenario as thought out by the organizer or designer. So even though it's not looking at it as a story-wise, the fictional frame and the starting point of the scenario for Long Live the Revolution isn't very interesting. It's different groups who are stuck at an inn because of bad weather. And that's like as far as the story goes when that LARP begins. After the game, when we talk about story, it might be a completely different thing, relating to what I said earlier today. This is a bit paraphrased from Jaakko Stenros, who is a Finnish scholar. He says that story is a recounting of a sequence of events. LARP, like life, has a sequence of events that can later on be turned into a story when they are told to someone. LARPs have settings, themes, events while they are played, and stories once they are finished. So if we look at Long Live the Revolution, if we would retell from our player perspective what happened in that LARP, we would have multiple stories. And what those stories would be about, it would be completely different stories. We might have stories who were about decline, maybe. If you would describe your story, it might be about decline. So someone else would be about freedom or renewal or rebirth or something like that. So we have multiple stories. And as Jaakko points out, much like life, when we look back at the different events in life, either we can view them as like completely random events, but then they're not meaningful. And in order to like rationalize the events of our life, we very often narrate them into a story. But the hard part is that you don't really know where the story starts and stops. Like at some point in your life, you might tell your life as a very sad story if you're in a very dark and depressing place in life. Like, oh, this and that action led to this and this consequence, and I was fired from my job, and that's the story of my life. But half a year later, you might be in a really good place, and then you pick out other events to tell, and then the story becomes something else. And that's the hard part, talking about the story of a LARP, because each and every player has a different story, and the way it is interpreted is different.
Maybe you know that with elderly people, they're working as a system, it's called a live book. So it's a one-on-one talk with people who are getting less memory. And so they get the memory, and they have their own book, their own history book. And to say said, if they have no memory at all anymore, they still have the book, and people can talk about what happened. Yeah. That's a very nice system. And I remember once I did something this funeral thing, and there was a very old man who there was no story at all. It's what you have to say in the funeral. So we looked to his life history, and then 20 years ago or something, he was at the trade union and fighting against whatever. So there was no buried an old man, was no story. But a hero who was fighting against the capitalists. So only by saying this, his whole life and his whole burn changed, because he got his story, and a different story than all the nurses told around. I think that's on an individual level exactly the same. You are a story until you tell it. You have to tell it.
Yeah.
And the listener just shapes it and says, "Oh, you are different."
I wanted to add something, because a lot of times people talk about, we have a view that the game has a main story after the LARP. But what happens is that there's a negotiation among players and organizers from the moment the game ends, where we kind of as a group decide what was the main story. And this, in this negotiation, a lot of times people get the dawning realization that, did I play a main character, or did the main LARP happen way over there? And this is a social construct, a narrative construct that we
Yes.
together make.
But it's also an opportunity for manipulation if you're game mastering games. Because by game mastering the debrief in certain ways, you can actually help construct the narrative in a way that makes the experience be more interesting than it would have been if you had just let everybody out of the room and not let them talk to each other, because of that negotiation of what actually happened and the telling of the story of the LARP, if you would like to manipulate the players into having a better experience.
And it's where secondary narrative gets so interesting in campaigns. So where you've got the story of a previous event that is carried in a folk song that's been written that is sung at the future events, and that's where it starts to get really beautiful, where the stories perpetuate themselves inside.
Yeah. So, as you have all experienced by now, a LARP is nothing like a novel and cannot be written like one, but it is like still one of the top 5 beginner mistakes when people are starting to write LARPs, is they try to write them like a novel or a script for a play. But really, you can't because of that chaotic multi-layered nature. I was at the LARP Writer Summer School, which is like a week-long program for LARPers, mainly young LARPers, who have LARPed maybe quite a lot, but they haven't organized their own LARPs. And I tried to describe it in this way. We could take an example of an organizer who wanted to do a LARP. Can you see these pictures? I might dim down just for this one so that you see what's happening here. And let's say that that's a LARP where we have 2 characters. We have Romeo and Juliet, played somewhere in Italy. Romeo is part of a family who are bitter rivals with the family of Juliet, but they love each other very much. And the organizers tried to write the description of the characters so that we're going to make a new take on the Romeo and Juliet story. In this LARP, it's going to be that they actually get each other in the end, and that we have a splendid wedding, and that's like the climax. And we have thought out the perfect Aristotelian curve for this 3-day LARP, and the climax of it will be the wedding, but then there might be rivalry at the wedding, and who knows what will happen. And trying to write the different characters to force it that way. One problem with LARP is that all the character descriptions are open for interpretations. So while Romeo might be like, oh, I love you very much, Juliet might interpret her character as the thing about the wedding and loving Romeo as not being the important thing, but the rivalry between the families being the important thing. Of course, you also have the mistake of everyone else at the LARP playing some kind of supportive cast or backdrop to the main story. But we could say that these organizers have learned from their mistakes, and they've chopped the LARP up into different acts, so they can specially instruct the players in different acts, so that there won't be any confusion about the interpretation that the wedding is the main thing. But even if you do that, the chaotic nature of LARP, you might end up with having like everyone super excited about the wedding, and the wedding happens the first day, and then the rest of the LARP becomes boring. Or if this is a LARP played in a Swedish fantasy village in the forest, you could also have other real-world consequences, like Romeo and Juliet here, and Romeo doesn't have a very good sense of the area and loses himself in the woods, and if one main character for some reason can't partake in the LARP, then the whole like dramatic structure of the LARP would falter. It wouldn't work that way. So that's like the way I try to retell it to these teenagers about the chaotic nature of LARPing and why you can't write LARPs as a novel, as a script. So talking about stories and how stories are negotiated afterwards, and talking about quests, I would say that the stories and the quests are part there are two sides of the same coin. And what we're really designing for when we are designing LARPs, at least when we are designing LARP, isn't designing the perfect story, the perfect quest. What we want to design, we're designing interaction. And we're designing interaction possibilities. So this is the new phrase that I've coined, the interaction possibility. And that the interaction possibility is the potential to interact in some way. And you could put in every interaction possibility in a LARP on a scale from rigid to loose. So rigid interaction possibilities on this scale would be the interaction possibilities in the LARP that are obvious, unambiguous, that have few possibilities, they're not very open to interpretation, very much more controlled and limited in scope. So a fetch quest or a kill quest would end up in the rigid interaction possibilities. The loose interaction possibilities would be more vague, ambiguous, have many possibilities, be more open, but they would tend to generate new interaction possibilities. They're not as limited in scope. And I'm going to give you a few examples of this, but the trail of thought here is that all interaction possibilities of a game, of a LARP, form the interaction structure. So when you look at the design of the LARP, you can look at the interaction structure of the LARP, and that the interaction structure in itself, you can't say if that's loose or rigid, but it can contain an infinite amount of all kinds of interaction possibilities. So we could have a great mix of everything between really rigid interaction possibilities and really loose interaction possibilities. And all those interaction possibilities mixed together form the interaction structure of the LARP. Different player styles are attracted to different kinds of interaction possibilities. When we play games with people who are young, 13, 14-year-olds, the rigid interaction possibilities are much easier to grasp. But they also demand much more from the game master. If you want to have a game full of kill quests and fetch quests and things like that, then you have to set it up like that, and you have to have the proper artifacts in the right place. And when this artifact enters play here, it triggers this quest, and you have to observe the chain of events. Whilst if you would talk to the general, very experienced Nordic-style LARPer, they would be totally interested in those quests. They would want more loose interaction possibilities. They would want to have relationships, themes to play on, abstract things. And those would in turn generate new interaction possibilities. And that would be much less demanding for the game master as well. So if you know your target audience, then you can also try to find out where do I put the effort in the interaction possibilities that I put into the LARP. And if we go back to Romeo and Juliet LARP again, the good example of doing this would be not to have main characters, but to fill the LARP with different interaction possibilities for all the different characters, not viewing any character as the main character, or some characters as sidekicks and other characters as backdrop or just other characters. And here we have a great mix of different interaction possibilities. Exploring oppression being quite a loose interaction possibility, and like in practical task or looking for the magical potion, quite a rigid interaction possibility. So I'm going to look at two games now, and with the lens of the interaction possibilities, to have two real-world examples. First, we have a game called The Troll Ring. The target audience for that game is 10, 11-year-olds, so it's quite young LARPers. It's about the Swedish folklore and part of the curriculum in the school. It has a scripted beginning. which means that it is a scene played out mainly by the game masters interacting with each other, more or less like a short theater snippet almost, so that they see what's LARPing all about, even though we've done a lesson with LARPing before. It has very specific quests handed out to specific players by the NPCs or the game masters, almost all of the quests being fetch quests of different sorts. It's like 12 magical artifacts hidden in the woods, and there are 2 or 3 competing witches, and all the different, and the kids play gnomes and trolls and fairies and stuff like that, who help out one of these 2 or 3 witches, and they want to find the magical artifacts before the other groups do that. And if the other groups have already taken them, then they can use their magic to steal the magical artifacts from them. It has several set pieces that can be activated if needed in the game. Like one of the main game master character could activate a scene where where he promises a bounty for anyone who solves a riddle he has, which is another rigid interaction possibility. And the NPCs are giving constant in-game instruction, because the kids always lose track of what they were going to do, and they can't remember almost nothing, like, where was that thing? And we have very helpful NPCs. Oh, I think it was over there. And also a very scripted end, like no matter how they play the game, it always ends with the same end scene, which is kind of a cool scene with a cauldron and smoke coming up from it, and the different game master characters play a short theater snippet at the end, filled with rigid interaction possibilities. But it also has hooks into quite loose interaction possibilities, but the kids very rarely play some of them. So we haven't put the effort in that end of the interaction structure. And a game you are more familiar with, the Long Live the Revolution. Here's an example list of the interaction possibilities in the game that is ordered from rigid to loose in how I view them as the most rigid and the most loose interaction possibility.
What are affordances?
That is a very good question. I could actually explain that. When we look at creating characters, we look at how can we create interesting characters, because we want to create characters who have a rich amount of interaction possibilities, right? So there are a few things in the character that doesn't have to do with interaction possibilities, like is the character clear and understandable? Like is it written in a clear way? Then we check that. But then we also look at connectivity in the LARP. Like is the character connected to other characters in the LARP in some way? Does it belong to a group? Yes or no? And if we do a workshop, then we also added a layer of random connectivity. When you walked around and then you had a relationship with someone who might be in a very competing group. And we can't control that, but it's another layer of connectivity. One mistake is for some people to create a character which in their mind, because in some LARPs you get to create your own characters, in their mind would be a very cool character because it would be cool in a book or in a movie. For instance, the silent ranger in the corner of the inn, who knows about everyone but doesn't know anyone. Very little connectivity to the other groups. People, some players who try that out find that it's not very playable and it's not very fun. But then we also look at affordances. What does this character afford? As in, it's a term I think coined in interaction design, the other kind of interaction design, what's it called? Or engineering design, like a doorknob affords being turned.
Okay.
Or a cup affords being held in a certain way.
You can think of it as is for.
Yes.
What is this is?
So if you would if you're playing a fancy LARP and you meet an orc in the forest, like it's a dark night, and you're walking all alone in the forest and you meet this orc. What does the orc afford?
Mm-hmm.
What does the orc afford?
XP.
Well, it depends on who you are.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the real answer. If you're a peasant, then the orc probably affords for you to turn the other way, run
Yeah.
screaming. If you are the knight, then the orc affords a mighty battle. If you are another orc, then maybe this orc affords a chat about the orcish politics. So depending who you are, depending what kind of game it is and who you are, different character affords different things. So then you look at a character and see from the other character's perspective and the other groups in the LARP, what does this character afford? And that's what we mean with affordances. And that can also pinpoint if some character is poorly written for the LARP. Like if you are the only orc in the LARP, there are no other orcs in the LARP, there are only peasants, and there are no knights in the LARP, then the orc will have quite a boring LARP, because the only affordances to the other characters is turning their back to the orc, running away screaming. Not very much interaction possibilities. But if we look at this list, you see that I have win a duel and fencing. Fencing is a bit higher up towards the loose scale of the interaction possibilities, because fencing can be used in more ways than the stated goal win a duel, because win a duel has like a set end, and when you reach that end, nothing else happens. But you also have the possibility of fencing either as practice or as a way to solve other conflicts. So that's why I put it higher up in the towards the loose end of the interaction possibilities. Pages, affordances, is more rigid. They are more obvious, they are clearer than Truffauds or Philistines' affordances. Page is the innkeeper. You know what to do when you encounter an innkeeper. But because pages' affordances are clearer and more obvious, they also tend to generate fewer other interaction possibilities. Because Paige, very often, the thing she does is to gossip and sell bread and wine. Whilst Truffauds' affordances are slightly under Philistine's affordances, because Philistine, that it could generate possibly a lot of other interaction possibilities, discussing politics, things like that, that you can't do with Truffaud. And the character of Philistine could also very much more easily take the stories in different directions than Truffaud's affordances. And on the most loose interaction possibility in this example is the written instruction in the bourgeoisie. What was it called? Group. What you seek is a rational reorganization of French society. Very hard to play on if you're 13, 14 years old. Very unambiguous, very, very loose, rigid possibility. But if you would give this, just that snippet of information, as the only thing to play on for a very experienced Nordic LARP player, they could LARP for 12 hours with just that, because it could regenerate so many other interaction possibilities. We're nearing the conclusion. Viewed through this lens, how do we define story and quest? Well, a quest is essentially a somewhat rigid interaction possibility planted by the organizer. Story, on the other hand, a LARP story is the structured interpretation of realized and unrealized interaction possibilities retold to assign meaning to the game experience. Because if you don't reflect upon the game experience afterwards and structure it into some kind of narrative, then it's more or less a meaningless thing of events. But also look at, I put in realized and unrealized interaction possibilities. Because very often when people retell the story of a LARP, or when they negotiate the story of a LARP, they add things that the character was thinking but didn't do, or how they felt but didn't act on. Yeah. The unrealized interaction possibilities. I think you had an example of unrealized interaction possibilities, which are very important to your story of the LARP, as I understood it yesterday.
So you're taking
you're taking a very sort of like narration approach to what a story is. A story is not a story until you start to recount it.
Yeah.
That is interesting.
That includes internally recounting it. If
Yeah,
you don't-
also telling it to yourself, like, what just happened? And then you sit and think about it.
So you do not consider a story, I mean, it's more philosophical than anything else, but something unfolding is not a story until you start to reflect on it.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what
So
I'm saying.
unfolding, so setting it up, it's a quest. Unfolding is still a quest. It's an active quest.
It might be a quest. Then
It might
you
be a
reject
quest and might not be a quest, depending on how rigid the interaction
Right.
possibility is.
But it's
But
a
it
chain of
only
events.
becomes a
It's
story
a
at the
chain
end.
of events.
But no, I don't think it's at the end, because I think as humans and as players, and I think we probably do the storying as players, not as characters, but that could vary. We start storying very quickly
Yeah.
after we've had the interaction and still during the game.
Yeah, so-
we
so
we
start,
might-
we start storifying during.
Yeah,
Yes.
It
But then
only completes afterwards, but it happens.
Yeah,
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
it partly happens during the game, but that can be renegotiated afterwards, and it can even be renegotiated years afterwards. Much like when we narrate the events of our own lives, and an encounter that we tell ourselves as being one thing, we might years afterwards discover that that encounter was something completely different, because the person you were interacting with had a complete different purpose with that encounter than you interpreted it as.
Right.
So if I encounter Teresa and she says something to me and I find that highly offensive, and then I keep retelling the story in my head of how Teresa was very offensive, and then years later I might find out that you were actually trying to help me in some way, and you were actually trying to be a good person. I might renegotiate the story of that encounter even as late as years afterwards, I believe.
So you're taking a very discourse approach as opposed to story approach.
What's the story approach? What do you mean by that?
Well, the story approach will be more about the content and all the different events and all that kind of, all that makes a story into it, whereas the discourse approach is more about how you tell it or how you.
Well, yeah, but story.
Now I'm raising the hand.
But that's when story is opposed to discourse as part of the story and discourse approach. I mean, story is used in a very particular way when you talk about story and discourse.
And where you're
But I
using
think
story
we-
there sounds like world for us.
Yes, so that's why I'm interested. I'm trying to.
Actually, one thing that was interesting was that on my way here, on the airport back home in Sweden, I bought the book Ender's Game, and I read the introduction by the man who has written it. And the last piece of the introduction was that where he said, he had more or less the same approach. He said that, remember when you read this book, that the book isn't a story in itself. My interpretation of the story isn't the story in itself. I just had something in mind. The book is the tool for me to tell it, but the story happens when you read the book and interpret what's important in it. And that is the real story of Ender's Game. When the telling and retelling between the author and the reader what is actually going on right now. So we had quite a similar
It's
approach.
the interaction.
But I think you were first.
To me, it's something that's very important for me, how you look to life. And life, it's the same. You experience something, and later on you tell it, or you're not telling it, but in the moment you're telling it, you become aware of it.
Yeah.
And I believe, and that comes to psychotherapy or religion or whatever, if you really know what's happened, it's the last day of your life, because you say, this was me. And maybe a little before you get some insights from this is me. Depends on the situation, because what's happened, but if you're ill also. So I turn the other way out. Any human being is a story. And on the moment you discover you are a story, you have some past and you have some dreaming of the future, that's what you are.
Yeah.
And all psychotherapy, religions or whatever, but it's not your story, it's as well the story of the culture, of the history, or what happened before, or coming up next time, and all those lines, but very quick, this is me. And if you're drunk or you're depressed, you say, I'm a bad guy for you. And if you're fear fights, you say, look what I all did. So you have many stories, but one moment, I think when you're dying really, because it's the end of all experiences. And then it starts, this was me. So story is always a reflection of what you was.
And then that was what I was into when I said that it's hard when we narrate our own life, because you can't really know like when to start and when to stop. Being fired from your job could in one of your stories be a worse incident, but the worst incident you've been through. But it could also later on in your life be retold that like that was the turning point, because then I really got the opportunity to become a game designer. And then the story is completely different, even though the exact same event is part of that story.
I think it's also good to say that the reason, because when we are saying this, we are kind of completely deconstructing story and there's nothing left of story. But what we're trying to do, my first goal setting up this stuff isn't to define what story is, but to understand how a LARP works. And in no way does any kind of coherent, we have a story before the game, describe what actually happens in a LARP. So we kind of have to end up, because it is a very chaotic medium and a truly collaborative medium and participatory medium, as opposed to, I mean, people say that there's a lot of people, you can't do a big Hollywood film with one person. You have a lot of people's input coming in, but you do have a director and you do have producers and you have not that many people who get to say, this is what we're doing. And you do have people going, this is what we're doing in a LARP, but they have much less power over the individual's experience. So we have to have a very chaotic model to describe what's actually, or to try to talk about what's actually happening.
And the reason why we are deconstructing story in that way is because it's so common that people try to approach LARP, writing LARP, as though there is a story. So this is just a tool for us to like, why are we...
I mean, this is great.
But I think they've been waiting, and you was first.
Yes, I mean, I think this is fantastically interesting, really. And I think you've come up with some very new ideas there as well. I mean, the way I was looking at it is thinking, okay, a bit like what Terry was saying, how do we consider how does a LARP work, and therefore how does it help us in designing it? Now, in some ways, and I think this is a very good starting model, is that in some cases, let's take, say, Long Live the Revolution from last night. If we were just doing that in terms of saying, great, we just want something whereby we just have interactions and we just have an interesting evening, you could probably have got away with something. For instance, we wouldn't need it at the end to say, okay, we're going to have some kind of trial. We could have left it very open-ended. But the problem as you're going into certain usages of that, as an example, if you're using, particularly say to teach history, which wasn't particularly last night, but if you were using that, which obviously you do in some educational LARPs, the problem is, in a sense, there is a story. And if we're talking about the French Revolution, the point is that the French Revolution happened in a certain way. So if you're teaching someone, it's fine to say there were lots of possibilities, and actually I think that's what a LARP is so good at, is to show that there were lots of possibilities, but there was still a story, or a whole set of stories, which happened a certain way. And I think if you take an example, say, in what you were doing last night, and I think that's why your idea of the different affordances is good, because let's take the innkeeper. If the innkeeper could do whatever they liked in that, they could have decided, oh, this is getting out of hand, we're not being paid, we'll close down. That's not a good option in terms of both the story, but actually in terms of experience of the French Revolution. So you lessen the possibilities there. And I think it's absolutely right that it's actually, say, Philistine who's got the greatest affordance, because probably the options that they make can make a wide amount of difference, but nevertheless, you have to control it in certain ways. So for instance, quite correctly when it came up, that Philistine could say, oh no, the aristocrats can get away. They say no, they can't get away because this is the way we are. So you still have to limit those affordances. I mean, I was talking earlier on to Miriam because one of the things that interests me is if you wanted to make this conform more to sort of teaching the French Revolution, one of the things about it of saying is that maybe you need to introduce some sequence, because the key thing about what happened in the French Revolution at that time was that actually it was slightly out of sequence, but that was fine, but you couldn't do that. But if you had two sequences, because in 1 year during the Terror, between 1793 and 94, what happens at the start of it, pretty much everyone supports the Terror. That's the point. At the end of it, pretty much no one supports the Terror. So what you're actually having to explain in history is what happened in between there. And some of that is to do with changes which took place externally. For instance, there was a big war threat up till about the beginning of 1794. After it went, people didn't see that as a big thing. But also, psychologically, people said, hell, what is going on? Now, I thought in doing just one single thing, that worked incredibly well in bringing some of those things out. But maybe I was thinking that what you could do in that is have a sequence, something that has one act which is earlier on and one act that is later on. There's different things, but I was just saying that you can, when you say sort of the story is just all of these interaction possibilities, but you are trying to limit them in a number of different ways, aren't you, to fit it might be to, if you're using it for something like history, but even if you're doing it as just entertainment, you're trying to optimize interactions, maybe certain types of interactions, whatever your objective is. So actually, I like the model. I think you probably have to build quite a lot on it, but I think it's a very interesting concept you've got there.
Yeah. Nathan?
Yeah, I think I largely agree with what you said. I'm not trying to call it a model. I don't think there's nothing to it to be a model, but it's something.
Yeah.
I think something's a story. I largely agree. Story is an emergent property, and it's subjectively created. Humans are designed to see patterns. We're so good at it, we see patterns even when they're not there. And essentially, that's what a story is. It's a memory trick where we remember the past by fitting it into certain patterns or templates. I would argue the hero's myth is probably one of them, and one of the major ones. That's a personal fetish of mine. Trying to create stories from the start is putting the cart before the horse. It's completely the wrong paradigm, the wrong approach. I've looked, as you know, I had an article up this year where I looked at what the creative writing theorists are saying, and heavily they argue for simulationism, bizarrely. It's not what I was expected to find. They also think you should write novels in a simulationist way and create a world and play out cause and effect, and not artificially force results to happen.
Mm-hmm. Sandy?
Yes, I mean, what I was going to say about the story, I mean, I thought that this model was very interesting, and I can find some inspiration into what we can do with this, because it's a very different way of looking into it, and to me that's very, very interesting. And I was also criticizing what you meant by story. I just wanted to clarify it as to how I could represent myself. Because as I'm reading your slides and I'm listening to you, I'm trying to make sense how that fits in my own mental model of what a story is. And I just wanted to make sure, but I think this is really, really interesting, because that kind of approach there, I think you probably agree, Henrik, is very different from what people tend to talk about in the interactive storytelling community in terms of computer science. And that's offering so many more possibilities compared to what is being done at the moment, and I think this is great.
Yeah. I just wanted to add that at the end, the definition that wasn't the thing I referred to as the model, more the interaction structure, and but maybe it's not a model, maybe it's just a trail of thought.
I think you need structure anyway, and I love to work with theologians, and if you have the biblical story, that's the structure. I mean, what's saying there, it's exactly for some people. So that's a structure you're always related to. If you just fantasize, I would say, a biblical story. I have the same with Grimm stories. Whatever Grimm says this way, and there are so many beautiful things in the Bible. Like in the beginning, it's Noah goes on the ark. It's in the Bible, and it's something like 6 weeks or something they go in the ocean. And I played one whole day with them. I said, what if we 6 weeks are all together with the whole zoo with us? Just tell us, it's fun to play the whole thing. What you're going to do after 2 weeks being at the zoo and nobody around. So the theological can explain anything. With this very line, it says 3 months later. I said, tell me what happened, and you play out. And it's so beautiful because it's not a fantasy play, it's studying the exact Holy Bible, so you cannot change anything with it. But you have to experience it from inside. And it's
I've been Jesus in the Last Supper Larp. I've lived that well.
Last comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that some people come from a very different conversation and a different paradigm. We are not being super original here. I want to be clear. This is where the conversation is in Nordic LARP theory, and I would warmly recommend the writings of Jakob Stenros, but very much so a Norwegian named Eirik Fatland. Maybe you want to.
It's actually a friend of mine who's worked with us before.
And he's really one of the great minds.
Not Erik. A friend of us who has
sorry.
worked with us before, called Anna Karin. She once said that every time you get a new and original idea about Nordic LARP, Eirik Fatland has already thought about it 5 years before you. And that's quite true. He's really good at it.
He's also very quiet. He's not got the high profile of.
I can write his.
He has a blog called the Larp Right, but he's also written. If any one of you would want to look into the Knutpunkt and Knutepunkt books, many of them are completely unreadable. I say this with love, but many of the articles are very hard to get through, and always look for the Fotland articles.
I'm going to spell Jakko's name.
And he, 2 A's, 2 K's.
Could you please put on the writer's website as well?
Yeah, we can, yes, and we can send you a link because Erik has written some articles specifically about how LARP works and about story and interaction, specifically interaction and interaction incentives. That is just the most useful thing I think I've ever read about LARP, ever, anywhere.
What we're going to do is that we're going to sort of report, put some videos and report on the activity, and we can put some maybe
very pointy question. This scale, do you think we've had to say this is a fader on the mixing desk?
No, it's not, because and it shouldn't be, because all the complete interaction structure of a LARP is always a mix between rigid and loose interaction possibilities, and that's why I said before that you can't say if a interaction structure is rigid or loose, but you can say if you've tilted it towards being more rigid or more loose. But I wanted to sum up what I'm doing here is. There are a lot of good writers on Nordic LARP theory, and as Teresa said, this is like nothing new. We're no geniuses here, and these are the people who I've read texts about, and there are lots of more people. But this is why I recommend to Google these names, because that's the text I've written, the text I've read that I know is good. And Erik's texts are good. Jaakko has written good things, and Markus Montola as well. But I think we could sum up. Some links. I know that few of you wanted links to. There are chamber games posted online, complete descriptions of games, Jeep form games, free form games, things like that you can run on your own time.
And do they write in English?
Yes.
Yes, they do.
All Nordic LARP discourse is written in English because it's between the Nordic countries, which include the Finns, and the Finns can't understand the Scandinavian languages. So everything is always in English.
So I'm just going to sum up, since we're running out of time. If you design a structure with an interaction structure, then with plenty of interaction possibilities, satisfying your player's preference on the rigid-loose scale, depending on who your target audience is, you will get participants who feel they have experienced an amazing story. So that's the conclusion to this Stories and Quests.